Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where we discuss international affairs. I'm Martin Zupko. As Japan navigates shifting domestic priorities and evolving global dynamics, its policies hold significant implications for regional security, economic stability, and global partnerships. Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba's ruling party and its junior partner lost their majority in the parliamentary election in October this year. The loss, much bigger than anticipated, is bad news for a leader who has only been in power for a month. For instance, the Associated Press wrote, "It's largely a reflection of voters' anger at the repeated financial scandals that have hit the Liberal Democratic Party, which has ruled Japan nearly without interruptions since 1955. Let's dive into the latest development in Japan and its implications underlined by uncertainty with our guest, Bill Emmott. Hello?
Hello, Martin. Good to be with you.
Bill Emmott is an independent writer and a consultant. He spent 26 years at The Economist, which he joined in 1980, working as a correspondent and editor in Brussels, Tokyo, and London on subjects ranging from politics to finance, economics, and business. In 1993, he was appointed Editor-in-Chief, a post he held for 13 years. Bill has written several books on Japan, the first one of which was The Sun Also Sets, Why Japan Will Not Be Number One, which was in 1989, and his latest book on Japan is Japan's Far More Female Future, which was published in Japanese by Nikkei in 2019 and in English by Oxford University Press in 2020. Other publications include, for instance, Deterrence, Diplomacy and the Risk of Conflict over Taiwan, The Fate of the West, The Battle to Save the World's Most Successful Political Idea, or, for instance, 2021 Vision, 20th Century Lessons for the 21st Century. Bill is also an Yoshida Fellow at the Tokyo College, University of Tokyo, Chairman of the Board of the Trinity College Dublin's Long Room Hub Arts and Humanities Research Institute, Chairman of the Japan Society of the UK, and Chairman of the Trustees of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and also many other roles that we don't have time to mention, but I'm sure that if you go to his personal website, you can see all the roles that Bill is involved in. Last thing I want to say about Bill is that in 2016, the Japanese government awarded him the Order of the Rising Sun, gold raised with a neck ribbon, for services to the UK-Japan relations. So I'm very happy that Bill accepted the invitation to speak about Japan, and especially what we're going to do today, we're going through several rounds of the questions, and we're going to apply that sort of layer of uncertainty because of the political situation in Japan. We also want to explain how the Japan is doing in terms of internal politics versus international arena or diplomacy. So let's start with the first question, Bill, and that's about the Liberal Democratic Party. We know that this party has been dominating in Japan. And I want to ask you about the limits that Japan has when the one party is ruling or has been ruling for so many years. How do you see this phenomenon?
Yes, I think it's true that the Liberal Democratic Party has been an unusually resilient ruling party in Japan. It's essentially run the country almost unbroken from 1955, broke briefly in 1993 when it had to, it lost an election and then it regained power, but only in a coalition. Then the same again happened in 2009, but just for 3 years. So apart from those two short periods, it's been unbroken. So what's the consequence of that for international politics? Well, one consequence is good, which is extreme stability and consistency. Although Japan has famously changed prime ministers quite quickly, it has not changed ruling parties, it has not changed government, and that means that foreign governments, United States, other governments in the West, governments in the region, have basically known who they are dealing with and had a consistency of approach. Possibly the negative consequence of having had such one-party rule since 1955 is that really successfully built across the whole of society about some aspects of international policy. If you'd had alternation of parties, then in other countries, in at least the international arena, that has a tendency to force a kind of acceptance of a consensus. Party competition has often focused in other countries on domestic policy, but left foreign policy as more or less a bipartisan issue. That's not always true, but it's often true. In Japan's case, because of that one-party dominance, I think arguably that consensus wasn't achieved until recently. However, I would say against that the Japan's international policy has essentially been determined by a mixture of its geography and its history. Its history, namely defeat in the Second World War, the American occupation after 1945 for 6 years, and then following that, a very close alliance with its former occupiers, the United States. Its geography during the Cold War, a geography which sort of left it nicely isolated away from major areas of conflict, but made it a kind of eastern frontier state with the Cold War, with the Soviet Union, just tipping the eastern side of Russia, being important to the United States from that point of view, but not in that Cold War period, facing a lot of direct threats of its own, which perhaps gave it the luxury that it did not have to worry about direct threats to itself. It could rely solely on the United States as its protector. Fast forward to today, geography makes a huge difference because Japan is on the front line, not just of the former Soviet Union, now Russia, but critically the rising China, now the world's second superpower, the world's second largest economy, an economy absolutely desirous of dominating Asia, and the rogue economy and country of North Korea. So Japan is on a different sort of front line now, post-Cold War. That geography has been highly consistent. I think because of the criticality now of the threats, particularly from China and North Korea, actually some of the consensus has begun to form across the political parties in Japan that actually wasn't really there during the Cold War.
Bill, there is a sort of confusion when I speak with students, because when you read the name Liberal Democratic Party, you have that sort of liberal tone and the perspective. But in fact, this political party is quite conservative when we read about the history of the party. Can you explain why is that sort of conservatism in this party?
I think that the Liberal Democratic Party, by its English name, is not really is rather a misleading name. Its name in Japanese, Jiminto, doesn't have those same ambiguous connotations, particularly the liberal part. But it's a conservative party, rather as the Christian Democrats were a conservative party in Italy or Germany during the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, as a center-right party that stood for a close relationship with the United States, but also was a sort of bulwark against communism. What many people don't understand about Japanese history is that actually communist parties and communist movements were quite strong in Japan in the 1940s and 1950s, as they were in other defeated countries such as France, Germany, France, of course, liberated but defeated during the Second War, and Italy, with its complicated emergence from the war. Communism was strong because it was an oppositional protest movement, and that was also true in Japan in the 1950s. And the Liberal Democratic Party formed itself as a bulwark against that. Now, secondly, it has evolved as a conservative party in quite a conservative country, a conservative party that has a nationalist element about the history of Japan, particularly 20th century history of Japan, but also a nationalist element with regarding the role of the emperor and the imperial system, a sort of traditionalist side to it, and then socially conservative, being somewhat conservative about equal rights, for example, to do with LGBT rights, and very much conservative about equal rights for women. So it has driven society, but also reflected society in many respects.
We mentioned that sort of uncertainty especially after the election in October this year. So let's put this layer on one of the most important aspects of the Japanese foreign policy, and that's the energy security, because we know that Japan is dependent on energy imports. So how do you see that decision-making process and reliance of Japan on international contracts for energy imports, especially in these times of uncertainty?
Well, I think you're right that Japan does rely heavily on energy imports. Renewable energy is a relatively small part of the mix in Japan. Nuclear energy was a very major part of Japan's energy mix until the earthquake and tsunami of 2011 caused the near meltdown of a nuclear power station, the Fukushima Daiichi power station in central Honshu, in central the main island of Japan, which then led to a large number of nuclear power stations being closed down or mothballed, really, for fear of future earthquake risk. And from close to 30% of Japan's electricity coming from nuclear, it dropped by about half of that. So that then left a gap. So what did Japan do to try to fill that gap? Well, it was rather slow, as I said, in renewables. There are reasons for that, to do with the depth of waters around Japan that make it hard to put wind turbines in. It's also a very mountainous country. But then there was a convenience, which is that a major oil and gas exporter, Russia, is a neighbor. So for some time, Japan made something of a bet on liquefied natural gas from Russia, investing in that in Russia, co-investing in the building of LNG terminals on the Sakhalin Island on the eastern side of Russia, and seeking to use that as a leverage towards perhaps persuading Russia to cede back some islands just off the coast of the northern island of Japan, off Hokkaido, that Russia, the Soviet Union, seized in the dying days of the Second World War. So this was a strategy that Japan followed, a mixture of sort of building some energy resilience through investment in Russia, LNG, with trying to use it for geopolitical and territorial purposes to force or to persuade President Putin to come to a deal about these northern islands. This, unfortunately, spectacularly failed. It did not leave Japan as dependent on Russian gas as Germany, for example, but nonetheless, it left Japan in a somewhat mixed position. And that's the situation that Japan finds itself in now. Obviously, we're now 2 years after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, 2 years after the joint sanctions that Japan joined on Russian government, on Russian assets, and therefore 2 years after something of a breach of the Japan-Russia relationship. So Japan is now struggling to work out what to do next to rebuild its energy security. And partly as a result of that, nuclear power actually is coming back onto the agenda. 10 years after the Fukushima Daiichi disaster, Prime Minister Ishiba ran in his campaign promising to campaign for the reopening of more nuclear power plants to increase or to raise back the proportion of Japanese energy that would come from nuclear power, for example. And he's beginning to try to make steps in that direction. But also, he and the government are going to have to try to drive renewable energy harder, which includes both wind, solar, and geothermal energy to try to fill the gap in Japan's energy supply.
And can you tell us a little bit about the attitude of society? Because you travel to Japan very often. What people say, what newspapers say about the reopening of the nuclear plants? Because I assume it's still a sensitive topic in Japan, especially when they consider that on one hand they have no choice because they need energy to run the country. But on the other hand, Fukushima is a very strong legacy.
It's a very sensitive issue, and I would say that the country is very divided over that issue, and even the Liberal Democratic Party is very divided over the issue. If we go back to the 2000s, a famous prime minister of the time was Junichiro Koizumi, who was a very flamboyant figure, was campaigned on a change ticket, and succeeded in being in power for 5 years and actually achieving quite a lot of change. Well, after the Fukushima Daiichi disaster, he became a campaigner against nuclear power. So you've got someone inside the Liberal Democratic Party, or at least as a former prime minister, who's been very negative about nuclear power. His son, Shinjiro Koizumi, was one of Ishiba's rivals for the leadership in the LDP in the election that took place in September. He came third in the race, but nonetheless he's a significant potential competitor for the future, or a candidate. And yet here's Mr. Ishiba trying to expand the role of nuclear power. I think that 10 years after the disaster, public opinion has moved somewhat in favor of expanding the role of nuclear power, particularly as these nuclear power stations are sitting unused, and therefore they are in the worst of both worlds. They are just as dangerous as they are if they are being used, because the possibility of an earthquake or a tsunami causing a meltdown is there, even if you're not producing electricity. So they're unused, and yet they're not producing electricity and therefore not contributing to cheap electricity, which is what they would represent since they've already been built. So I think that public opinion is divided. It doesn't want new nuclear power stations to be built. It doesn't want ones that are highly dangerous to be just left alone. They should be starting the decommissioning process, as is the case with Fukushima. But I think that 10 years later, reluctantly, opinion is swinging back in favor of, well, we've got these power stations, they're sitting next to our towns, we better benefit from them.
We know that Japan is sort of a leader in proposing climate change policies, especially in renewable energies and green energy sustainability, and all those issues related to energy transition. But on the other hand, when we read about those nuclear power plants, and Japan is slightly behind the plan of environmental changes in terms of the renewable energies, then there is a logic question, and sort of many people ask, is Japan capable to be a leader in the energy transition and still propose those changes while domestically is slightly behind the plan?
I think that Japan has not really been an enthusiastic campaigner for the green transition. Famously, in the 1970s, Japanese industry reacted much quicker than American or European industry to the oil shock of 1973, increasing its efficiency, because partly it was essential for its survival to do that, but also because it was dealing with a legacy of severe environmental damage at the same time. There was a cleanup underway as well as an efficiency drive. And that, I think, led many people to think, well, they did it once before in the 1970s, moving from being the dirtiest industrial country in the world to the cleanest for a period. Surely they'll do it again. And the fact is that they haven't. And they haven't because I think big business in Japan doesn't see the case for it. has not saw a profit benefit from being a leader in this in Japan, and has been struggling with other competitive challenges, particularly against Chinese and South Korean competition in the export markets, and therefore has actually rather lagged in investing in the green transition. Now, the area where perhaps it's a more mixed story is in the car industry, where although Japanese car makers are somewhat behind in electric vehicles, they're highly advanced in hybrid technology, particularly Toyota, but also others. And so they may be in a better position, for example, than the German car industry, which has not been hybrid sufficiently, but equally is behind on electronic vehicles. So the Japanese industry is in a bit of a middle position. But I think because also of Japan's long economic stagnation and difficulty in achieving growth, there has definitely not been a priority either for big business or for the LDP to prioritize climate change and the green transition. They have talked the talk, but they have not walked the walk.
I see. That's a nice way how to say it. Let's go from energy to security issues. And those who study Japan, they know about the Article 9 and its position. So let's, maybe you can briefly explain Article 9 for those who don't know what it means. And I would like to ask you about the perception of this article in 2024, especially when we see that Japan is trying to be more proactive in international security.
So Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which is a constitution written by the American occupying authorities under the leadership of General MacArthur, Article 9 renounced the ability of Japan to have what was called the tools of the instruments of war, means of making war in perpetuity. That therefore is interpreted as meaning that Japan should not have an army, should not have a navy, should not have an air force, should not be able to conduct military operations overseas. Now, that article has acted as a strong constitutional restraint, apart from the fact that Japan began to build a navy and an army and an air force, starting as soon as it became independent in the 1950s, in fact, under American encouragement, and it called it a self-defense force, the Japan Self-Defense Force. Well, how do you reconcile these two things? Well, the Americans knew that they were fighting a war first of all in Korea, in the Korean War, 1951 to 53. Then they were fighting the Vietnam War in the 1960s. They needed Japan as a support base and also a supplier, and they wanted to allow Japan to build in sufficient forces to be able to, at least in principle, defend itself without their help. So this concept of self-defense became accepted, but with an implicit but never legal limit on how much of Japan's GDP the country could spend on defense. That is not in the constitution, but nonetheless, a convention was built up which said we shouldn't spend more than 1% of GDP on defense. Through the Cold War, that wasn't a problem, either for Japan or the United States. United States was principally benefiting from Japan as a base, big American bases in Okinawa, but also on the Japanese mainland, in and around Tokyo and elsewhere. A prime minister of the 1980s, when I was a young correspondent in Japan, described Japan's role as being an unsinkable aircraft carrier alongside the coast of Northeast Asia on behalf of the United States and the West. So Japan was playing a role, but didn't feel a big pressure to build up its own defense forces. Fast forward to the 1990s, but really especially the 2000s, and the rise of China and the North Korean nuclear program start to change that and change thinking about that. And so Japan, under the leadership especially of Prime Minister Abe, from 2012 onward, starts to try to prepare the ground, both with public opinion and legally, for building up a sufficient military force, both to be able to defend itself and to be able to contribute alongside its allies, particularly the United States, to the deterrence of aggression, particularly by China, but also by North Korea, within the Asian region. So that builds up. Legal changes are made to redefine self-defense as including working to help your ally defend themselves if, say, an American naval flotilla was under attack in the South China Sea or somewhere near Japan, legally, starting from the Abe period, Japan enabled itself to be able to work to fight in support of that, on the principle that this was a form of collective self-defense. But still, Article 9 is not unrepealed. It is still there, and it still acts as something of a restraint on what, in principle, Japan can do in the case of a conflict. Now, starting in 2022, under the prime ministership of Fumio Kishida, really the Abe vision has finally been able to be put into practice, and Kishida introduced a plan to double Japan's defense spending between 2022 and 2027, with a target of achieving 2% of GDP by 2027, major expansion, including building a proper intelligence agency, building an important cyber force, which hasn't existed in any scale before, and obviously expanding the capability of the Air Force and the Navy, especially to be able to deter attacks from North Korea using counter-strike missile capabilities. So there's been a big expansion, but there is still the question of Article 9. It's often said, slightly jokingly, that if you have a war game involving a Japanese team, let's say a Canadian team, a British team, an Australian team, a Taiwanese team, then the other teams spend their time working out strategy. The Japanese team spend half their time working out whether what they're thinking of is in line with the law and the Constitution. Now, this is an exaggeration, but nonetheless, it's true that still the constitutional restraint raises some doubts over what Japan can contribute to regional security. Nonetheless, let's look at the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, as it's called. It is a navy that is the size of the French and British navies combined. This is a major navy, as it should be, given the size of the Japanese archipelago of islands and the size of its territorial waters, of its exclusive economic zone. This is a very serious navy by global standards, and it now has 2 small aircraft carriers, originally commissioned as helicopter carriers, but which were being converted to be able to carry American fighter planes. I mean, as part of the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force. So this is a very serious military, despite the restraints of Article 9.
I have 2 follow-up questions, Bill. The first one, do you think that this article will be modified in the future, considering the geopolitics around Japan? And the second question, when we speak about Japan and military, there is a very strong impact of the US military because of the US-Japan security alliance. So what sort of condition is this alliance at the moment? And what sort of development we can expect, considering that internal political instability at the moment in Japan?
I think that Article 9, first of all, is likely to be changed at some point in the future. Public opinion polls show now, within the last couple of years, for the first time, a majority of the Japanese public being in favor of revising Article 9. It's not clear that they agree about how it should be revised, yet, but there's a willingness and to revise it to produce a more normal, like constitutional background for the Japanese military. And I think it's become true that the Japanese military has lost its stigma, which it had in the past as a force that wasn't very respected. It has become now quite respected, both because of its humanitarian work within Japan, especially after the 2011 tsunami and nuclear disaster, but also in the region. The stigma has gone, but there's a very wide acceptance of the real risk of conflict taking place in the South China Sea, around Taiwan, or indeed with North Korea. And as a result, I think that increased perception of threat held by the Japanese public and believed by the Japanese public have led people to support both the defense build-up and some sort of revision of Article 9. So does the political uncertainty weigh on this? I think it does, because it is hard to expect decisive leadership from prime ministers who don't expect or are not expected by their colleagues to be in office for more than another 6 months or another 12 months. So a lack of continuity does have some impact. Although there is now a clear acceptance across the board within the Liberal Democratic Party and I think with the opposition parties that these security threats are real and need to be countered. Nonetheless, lack of continuity of decision-making is definitely a factor that is liable to weaken Japan's position, because particularly it means that its allies, including the United States, are not very convinced by who they are talking to and what kind of agreements they can make. You asked about the state of the US-Japan alliance. I think the US-Japan alliance is pretty strong, particularly because Japan has been spending a lot more money on its defense and is demonstrating that it can make a real contribution in seeking to deter China from invading Taiwan, which is the principal goal of the United States in the region today. And Japan is also playing a significant role in supporting the Philippines in its efforts to resist pressure from China in the South China Sea and China's incursion into Philippines' economic zones. So Japan is now accepted as a real contributor by the United States, and therefore as a partner that there is a possibility of working alongside with, even in the case of a proper hot conflict. In comes Donald Trump into the White House on January the 20th next year. Does this change things? I think it doesn't change things very much for Japan compared with the way it may change things for NATO and Ukraine and Europe. I think Trump and the people around him have a view about China and a view about the security threats in East Asia, which is really quite similar to the view that was held by the Biden administration. And like the Biden administration, they will respect and value the way in which Japan is contributing more to their collective efforts. I don't doubt that President Trump will try to act as a bully, pressuring Japan to do even more, pressuring Japan to take even more of responsibility, because that's his style. But I don't think for Japan, the next 4 years promises to be a major break from the previous 4 in anything comparable to the way in which that could be the case for Europe in its relationship with the United States.
When I discuss some security issues regarding Japan, I always face those questions about South Korea, especially from some bright students who are arguing that if United States is having or is pursuing the alliance with Japan, and also United States is helping South Korea, why Japan and South Korea are not getting closer in sort of security, perhaps energy, or even economic cooperation. And I always say, because there is that history that is unresolved and the symbolism, which is super important in Asia. So despite that we know about the history, we know about symbolism and those little diplomatic steps that were made by both sides, at the moment when we have the war in Ukraine, the Middle East, also the Taiwan issue is sort of questionable for the future. Do you see any opportunity window for Japan and South Korea to get closer in security cooperation?
I think that the opportunities for Japan and South Korea to get closer are limited by the volatility of South Korea's own politics. So why is the history issue such a constraint between Japan and South Korea when it is not a constraint between Germany and France, for example, or Germany and Poland, when there is a similarly negative history between them? Well, one answer is that the European Union exists and has accelerated and built a framework for that reconciliation in Europe. Okay, that's true. But the other answer is that within South Korean politics, it is still the case that the use of that history as a weapon to beat the opposition and to rally nationalism remains highly vibrant. So that any efforts that Japan makes to achieve reconciliation over some of the real issues from the past then tend to blow up in their faces when the next election comes along in South Korea and the opposition, whichever side it is, uses that against them. And this is a restraint on their collaboration because it means that long-term planning is very difficult for the governments of the two countries, but also for the militaries of the two countries. I think that in the face of the threat of China, the threat of North Korea, discrete collaboration is increasing. And when I say discrete, I mean between intelligence agencies, for example, between cyber agencies, and at a lower level between the militaries. But it doesn't and cannot reach a high level of political collaboration at the top level because of that restraint put on by the nature of South Korean politics, which is echoed in Japanese politics, by the way. There is also a kind of anti-South Korean streak in some elements of Japanese nationalism. It's a great shame, and I think it's a reason to lament. It's something to lament, but one of the tasks for the United States is, in a way, and has been for decades now, to act as a kind of bridge between the two countries. They can't collaborate directly, but they can collaborate essentially through the United States, which has very strong bilateral alliance with both countries. So the United States is the channel through which collaboration happens.
The next question is related to Ishiba's statement about the NATO-like regional security arrangement in Asia. I remember when he became the prime minister, that statement was not well received, for instance, in India. And it causes some sort of questions about why Japan wants a NATO-like regional security. So how do you see this proactive movement of Ishiba straight after his election as a prime minister? Because we know that before prime minister, he was responsible for many security questions.
I think that Mr. Ishiba's idea of a so-called Asian NATO was not well received in Japan either. And the reason it wasn't well received in Japan is because those in the foreign and military establishments in Japan know that there is no chance of countries in Southeast Asia, let alone as far away as India, signing up to any form of collective security treaty that is in any way comparable to NATO. So, and they feel that this idea risks antagonizing some of those friendly countries in Southeast Asia that they've been cultivating for some time. Now, to be fair to Mr. Ishiba, quite probably he did not really mean a treaty-based collective security organization. What he means is that Asian nations should collaborate more in order to build their own collective security, but perhaps without a formal structure. Expressed in that way, it's not so difficult to accept, and indeed, it's not so difficult to imagine such a thing emerging, particularly between the countries around the South China Sea, who share a common security threat and a common problem of how to face up to China. But I think Mr. Ishiba's problem was that he was looking for provocative slogans, particularly during his time as a kind of permitted maverick outsider within the LDP, which has lasted several years after all, even since the Abe period, and perhaps he got carried away with that maverick status. But I think now we don't hear him talking about an Asian NATO. He's not followed that up since he's been in government, and I think that he would accept that this is really not something that he can really expect to be able to develop, and probably couldn't, even if he was likely to survive as prime minister for very long, which on current trends, it looks like he will not.
When we speak about Taiwan, we usually have China and the United States as the main actors. But you already stated how big is the Japanese Navy and how Japan is approaching that international security issues in more proactive way. So what about if we put the question, what would be the role, or what is the role of Japan in Taiwan Strait, especially when we speak about security?
Well, the nearest island to Taiwan, apart from the Chinese mainland, is Yonaguni, which is a Japanese, the most southwestern island in the Japanese archipelago, and it's only just over 100 kilometers from Taiwan. It's really very close. So that gives Japan obviously a clear interest. It has the string of islands running through Okinawa, down through the so-called Ryukyu or Nansei chain, right down almost to Taiwan. That gives it both an interest because it does not want a conflict in its waters. It does not want those waters to be dominated by a superpower, namely China. But also it gives it access to the region for its military forces and for its allies' military forces, because there are bases, facilities that can be there quite close to Taiwan. So this means Japan is keenly interested in what happens, but also has moved forces to those islands down near Taiwan, particularly electronic warfare operations, but also missile defense operations. And I'm sure the United States is also being able to build up logistical supplies for use in the event of a conflict in those islands. And so Japan has become more useful simply because of its geographical fortune or misfortune of being a very close country to Taiwan. I think that Japan, like the other countries of the region, realizes that Taiwan is not simply a historical issue. In terms of China's claim over Taiwan, going back to when it became a Japanese colony in 1895, and Taiwan is an unfinished part of the Chinese Civil War, given that Taiwan is where the nationalist Kuomintang leader Chiang Kai-shek escaped to when he lost the civil war against the communists. That's the historical issue, but there's also an extremely important strategic issue, which is that whoever controls Taiwan will control that whole sea area in the Western Pacific, inside the so-called first island chain, running south in the South China Sea and north up the Japanese string of islands. And currently no one controls Taiwan. But if China controlled Taiwan, this would be a major threat to all those countries in the region who depend on those sea lanes, very strongly and prominently among them, Japan.
How do you see sort of Chinese economic leverage? Because we know Japan and China, they have quite active economic relations. And when I speak with Chinese scholars, they say that Japan must be careful because we can cancel the contracts So how do you see this leverage?
Well, I think that Japan is very intertwined with China, of course, in its export markets and with investments in China. But it's not so dependent on China in overall terms as to feel that that's a powerful piece of leverage that China has. Definitely, Japan has for a long time been aware of the risks of losing technology to Chinese competitors, of China being potential both a competitor but also a potential pirate to try to acquire Japanese technology by covert means, but also of the potential dependencies that could be built up based on excessive exposure in certain markets or with certain critical materials. And just as de-risking is the slogan, the phrase that is very common in the United States and Europe, so it is in Japan. And so Japanese industry, led by the Japanese government, which passed an Economic Security Act 2 years ago, and has been seeking to implement it in collaboration with Japanese industry, they all know that they need to make sure that China does not have leverage over them in the event of a breakdown in relations.
We made a smooth transition to an economic round that I have 3 questions in this round. And the first one is, sometimes I wonder if Japan needs those resources for technology, for development, for producing semiconductor industry products. They need some resources. So does Japan have any answer to Belt and Road Initiative that China is using to secure its sources?
Well, I think that Japan used to be the biggest capital exporter in the world in the 1980s and early 1990s. And so it is used to that sensation that it can achieve influence around the world through its capital exports, through building roads, buying real estate, establishing farms, and so forth. But its capital exports have declined as its economy has matured and changed. And after the financial collapse of the 1990s, now, or at least until several years ago, China took that place as being the big capital exporter. And the big capital exports were channeled through the Belt and Road Initiative, not only, but substantially for those public policy purposes and strategic purposes of the Chinese government. Now, China's capital exports are declining. Why? Because China's economy is in trouble, and because it's had a collapse of its property market and construction market with high levels of debt that have reduced its ability to export capital in the same way as it did in its, what you might call its heyday. So one first answer is that I think that sense of competition is actually now changing as China has peaked in its ability to export capital in that way. But secondly, on a smaller scale than it used to in the past, Japan is indeed trying to make strategic investments, particularly in Africa and in India. Perhaps those are the 2 largest collective destinations, if you like, for those kind of strategic investments by Japan, seeking to ensure that it has a diversification of sources of supply, but also so that it does have its own relationships with those countries, rather than being crowded out by a country like China. And in both cases, Japan's efforts have been pretty long-term and pretty sustained, never of the high scale that the Belt and Road Initiative and prominence the Belt and Road Initiative has produced, but nonetheless, sustained over time, it's quite significant.
To sustain or to adopt those safeguards in its technological advancements and production and technology, there is one question I am interested in, and that's Japanese economic diplomacy to secure international relations and international contracts. So can you tell us a little bit about the most significant advantages, but also about some shortcomings of that diplomacy based on your research and experience?
Well, I think that the biggest achievement of Japanese economic diplomacy was in the rescue of the so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership, a partnership of intended to be 12 countries in Asia and across the Pacific for a free trade area and setting common rules for investment that had been pioneered and pushed by the Obama administration following early ideas from the Bush administration. This collapsed in 2016 when Hillary Clinton renounced it in the campaign, and then Donald Trump canceled it when he came into office. So it seemed like it was in collapse, and Japan, in collaboration with Australia, rescued it and achieved its resurrection and a new title of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was signed, I think, a year later among 11 countries, and is the deepest free trade and investment rule setting body covering the Pacific and East and Southeast Asia. So that was a major piece of diplomatic achievement, but also then gives Japan like a seat, almost at the driving seat, out of a major table for setting the rules for international trade within the region that matters most to it, namely, obviously, Southeast Asia and the Pacific. China is not a member. China is not able to dominate it, and that has given Japan a big advantage. Second piece of positive analysis around Japan's economic diplomacy is its economic diplomacy in Southeast Asia and with India. The reason this is important is because it's important that those countries, who are, after all, in the backyard of China, feel the ability to be independent of China, feel the ability to benefit both from, obviously, from China, but also from access to markets and to investment from other countries, and feel that access is going to be sustained. The United States has been very bad at doing that, partly because it's got a global interest and therefore its attention moves so easily from one issue to another, but also Southeast Asia is far away. And having a sustained influence on Southeast Asia is not possible, especially when you've got an anti-trade, anti-free trade politics in Congress, which was what America has had for the last 10 years, and even more so now under Donald Trump. So Japan has been important, but also had an opportunity to really be the front runner and the leader in economic diplomacy in Southeast Asia and with India, for the West, but also really primarily for itself. And that, I think, is what has been highly successful. Does Japan have a weakness in economic diplomacy? I'd say its weakness probably is related to some degree to its political instability. It's changing. It's a consistent party, but changing leaders, and that leads to a difficulty of trust, but also to the weakness of its economy since the 1990s, which has made Japan a less attractive market to gain access to, and a less attractive place to link yourself to. Obviously, it's still the world's third largest economy. It's a major economy, but nonetheless, it's not the growth machine that it was in the past, and therefore, it's not a strong tool for an economic diplomat.
One of the weaknesses that I observed, based on my personal experience, is sometimes slightly slower decision-making process. So you would expect more dynamic approach, but it's slightly slower than you expect. So you must wait, and then they are very diligent in outcomes, so that's all right. But in terms of the process, sometimes I observe that sort of, they have time to decide, and they need many consultants and all those hierarchy that the idea is going through. So this is something I observe based on my experience.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely correct. This is a bureaucracy, not a dictatorship. It's not even really characterized principally by its democratic nature. It's a collective decision-making machine, if you like, and that takes time. whether it's with a Japanese company or above all with the Japanese government and Japanese system. Decisions are taken slowly based on careful consensus building and an absorption of information. And you're absolutely right. If you are a fast decision maker, let's say in a dictator-run country, you're going to get impatient with Japan, and many others also get impatient.
Right. Bill, the last question for today's interview. You are chairman of the Japan Society in the United Kingdom. What is the role of such a society or institution in the contemporary international relations?
I think that the Japan Society is a way at a non-governmental level, because it's a non-government body, it's a charity in Britain. It acts as a forum to bring people together. It enables dialogue to happen independent of governments between both the peoples of Japan and the people of Britain, as in webinars that I ran during COVID, in which I always had a Japanese speaker and a British speaker talking about the same subject, but comparing ideas. But then in Britain, in building the network between Japanese business, Japanese community, and British community. So I think such a society is a glue that connects people together. It cannot be powerfully influential because it's too small, but nonetheless it acts as a channel through which connections can happen. And this year we had the honor of running a joint reception, which I hosted and had to give a speech at for the visiting Emperor of Japan during his state visit to Britain. And that brought together a lot of influential people, but also perhaps helped the Japan Society lift its reputation and influence above its modest resources by that association with, like, the most establishment element of Japanese society, the imperial family.
Bill, many thanks for your insightful thoughts and your shared research outcomes and experience, your thoughts. It was great to listen to you and to ask you those questions because, as we know, it's great that you have that opportunity to be in touch with Japan through your research, through your roles and different positions that you have in various institutions. So thank you again for being on IR Thinker.
Thank you for having me. It's been a very enjoyable conversation.
Thank you.